Okay, so I don't want you to be thinking that regional areas are like some remote village somewhere that has no electricity or running water, or no, nothing of that sort. Hi, and thank you for stopping by my channel today. My name is Chioma. If this is the first time that you are stopping by here, I'm so happy to have you. On my channel, I share my experience of living in Australia as a Nigerian, and the content that I put out here is related to my relocation experience. And so I touch on topics about immigration to Australia, family, work, settling into life here, starting a business, and lots of other things that are related or attached to that experience of living as a Nigerian in Australia. Don't forget to like, to share, and to subscribe if the content that I put out here resonates with you. Okay, so in today's video, I want to talk about the popular pathways to migrate to Australia. So I just want you to keep in mind that this is just an overview. Today's video is an overview of the popular pathways. It is not by any means an exhaustive list, okay? Because there's so many different ways, so many different subclasses that Australia offers to people who want to come into the country. But I am dwelling on the pathways that I know that a lot of people who have migrated to Australia recently, and especially from places in Africa, countries in Africa, have used to come into Australia. So that's what I'm going to be dwelling on in this video. I will not be going into too many details because there's just a lot of information to take in when it comes to immigration and visas and, stuff related to that. So my intention is that I give you an overview in this video, touch a little bit on each of them, but I will be going into details in subsequent videos, okay? So let's get into it. For a lot of people coming from countries in Africa, the popular pathways are through study, the skilled migration programs, and also employer sponsorship. These are the three major pathways that I know a lot of people have taken advantage of recently to migrate to Australia. So let's talk about them one after the other. Let's begin with study. Now, if you are studying in Australia with the hopes of becoming a permanent resident one day, and you are looking to ladder into permanent residency through study, then there's a few things you need to keep in mind when it comes to making a decision around your study options, okay? So one of them is that you need to make sure, this might be the most important one actually. So you need to make sure that whatever course you're coming to study is captured on the relevant skilled occupation list. And for the purpose of migration, Australia has 3 of such lists, which are like the main ones. One of them is the medium and long-term strategic skills list. Okay, it's the MLTSSL. There's the short-term skilled occupation list, and there's the regional occupation list. Okay. Another thing is that you need to check the assessing authority for the occupation that you would hope to nominate towards your permanent residency. So what I mean by this is that every occupation has an assessing authority here. And what the assessing authority does is to ensure that people coming into Australia who have skills in that occupation have a way of assessing those skills to make sure that they are on par with Australian standards. And at the same skill level as it obtains in Australia. So that's what the skill assessing authority is there for. Now, it is important that you check the skill assessing authority for your particular occupation or for the course that you're coming to study, because you want to find out what requirements are tied to becoming eligible for permanent residency through that occupation. For instance, you might check on the list and be like, oh, social work is on the list. So do I just come in and study social work at any level? The answer is no. When you check the skill assessing authority for social workers here in Australia, you might then find out that for you to qualify to become a permanent resident, you must have a qualification in social work that is at least at a bachelor degree level or higher. So if you come in here and you study a diploma in social work, unfortunately, that will not qualify you for permanent residence. So that's what I mean by checking your assessing authority to find out exactly what requirements are necessary for you to qualify or become eligible to apply for permanent residency. Another thing that I would generally, generally speaking, I would encourage you to do is to aim to study a course that would lead to a bachelor degree or higher. So a bachelor degree, a master's degree, or even doctoral level study. And the reason for this is generally because when it comes time for you to apply for permanent residency, and especially if you're going through one of the skilled migration options, you would have to go through something called the points test. So the skilled migration options are points tested. So what it basically means is that there's a list of categories that you need to score points under. Each category has a maximum score and a minimum score that you can have within that category. And if you study towards a bachelor degree or higher, then you would have a higher score in the qualifications category. If you study something lower than a bachelor degree, maybe you get a trade certificate or a diploma or something, you will not be getting as much points as someone who studies towards a bachelor degree. I think within that category, the highest score you can get is if you study up to a doctoral degree, a doctoral level. And again, I'm going to put links to everything that I'm talking about in the description box so that you can read these things up on your own. Okay, let's move on to skilled migration. Now, with skilled migration, there are two pathways. There are visas you can get through the skilled migration programs that are permanent residency visas, which means that from the moment you're granted those visas, you will be a permanent resident, whether you're inside Australia or outside Australia when you apply. There are also the provisional visas, which would then lead to permanent residency if you meet additional requirements. So the most common skilled migration programs or visas are the independent skilled migration, which is 189. This will lead to the grant of a permanent visa. So if you're granted that visa, whether you're onshore or offshore, you become an Australian permanent resident. And the skilled independent visa is a federal option or a federal pathway, which means that you're not tied to a particular state. You do not apply for that visa through a state or through an Australian territory. You apply independently, okay? And if you meet the requirements and you're granted that visa, you become a permanent resident. The second option that will lead to the grant of a permanent residency visa as well is the skilled nominated visa. So as the name implies, it just means that you would need to be nominated by a state or an Australian territory for you to be granted that visa, and the visa subclass is 190. So it is a permanent visa, which means that if you get nominated by a state, if your nomination process goes through smoothly and you go on to apply and you're granted that visa, then you will become a permanent resident as well, whether you're in Australia or outside Australia when that visa is granted. The difference between the skilled nominated visa and the independent skilled migration visa is that with the skilled nominated visa, I think I've already mentioned this, you would need to be nominated by a state. So how it works is that first of all, you check on the relevant list, make sure that your occupation is captured on the relevant list that is attached to the state that you want to apply through. So every state has got their own lists. So you need to check the list for the states that you want to migrate to. And then if your occupation is listed on there and you meet all the requirements, then you can apply to the state to nominate you to migrate to that state. So when you express your interest, if the state picks you up and grants you a nomination, you will then be issued an invitation to apply for permanent residency. So what it means is that if you are granted permanent residency through the skilled nominated visa pathway, you will only be allowed to live in the state that nominated you or the territory that nominated you. So when you first come into Australia, the minimum residential requirements within the state that nominated you is 2 years. You must stay in that state for at least 2 years before you're free to go wherever else you might want to settle in Australia. Okay, so that's the difference between the skilled independent migration visa and the skilled nominated visa. So we move on to the provisional visa pathways. The provisional visas mostly apply to regional migration. So a regional area in Australia for the purpose of migration is a low population area, and it could be a territory as well. So, you know, general information about Australia. Australia has got states, they've got territories. So with this provisional visas, all right, they are attached to regional migration, which means that if you go for one of these options, it means that you will have to live and work in a regional area. And I was going to explain, a regional area for the purpose of migration just means a low population area. And the government is using these visa pathways to sort of incentivize migration to these places to further develop those areas. So the two provisional visas that are available for regional migration are the skilled work regional provisional visa, which is the subclass 491. And this visa is tied to nomination by a state or territory or sponsorship from an eligible family member or a relative. So what this means is that you will still need to apply through a particular state or territory, and you would need to express your interest for them to nominate you. But the nomination is tied to regional migration, which means that you will indicate in your application that you want to be nominated to come live in a region within that state or within that territory. And so if your expression of interest goes through smoothly and you get nominated by the state, it means you will be granted a provisional visa, which allows you to come in and settle in the regional area that you indicated in your application. Now, the provisional visa allows you to stay for up to 5 years within that regional area, but after living and working there for at least 3 years in an eligible occupation, you can become eligible to apply for permanent residency. Okay, so that's it with the skilled work regional provisional visa. The other provisional visa that is also tied to regional migration is the skilled employer sponsored regional provisional visa. I know that's a mouthful. The visa subclass is 494. So the difference between the skilled employer sponsored regional provisional visa and the skilled work regional provisional visa is that this one is tied to employer sponsorship. So an employer from a regional area would nominate you to come and work for them in that regional area before you are granted the provisional visa 494. So when you arrive in the regional area, you would take up employment with this employer. And again, just as with the other provisional visa option, you would have to live and work in that occupation for at least 3 years before you become eligible to apply for permanent residency. Now, in terms of how popular these options are, there's not a lot of people that I know who have gone through the provisional visas that are attached to regional migration. But in saying that, in recent years, as a matter of fact, the whole program around regional migration has been revamped in the past couple of years, and so there's more and more people taking up that option because it offers some flexibility and also some advantage when it comes to the points tested system. So if you indicate interest in migrating to a regional area, for instance, you get even higher points than when you are nominated to come live in a state. Okay, so there's all those different perks that are attached to migrating to regional areas. And like I said, the Australian government is trying to attract people to live in these places. When you hear regional area and low population areas, I don't know what image comes into your mind, but I don't want you to be thinking that these places are like remote bushes somewhere. A lot of these places actually, let me not say some, a lot of them, majority of them are well-developed towns, just that there's not a lot of people living there, and the government is wanting to boost the populations in these places, and also by so doing boost employment potential as well, and just generally have a more robust system that attracts people to live, study and work in these places. Okay, so I don't want you to be thinking that regional areas are like some remote village somewhere that has no electricity or running water, or no, nothing of that sort. Okay, so let's move on to the third and final popular migration pathway to Australia, which is the employer sponsorship. The employer sponsorship, I know I mentioned a little bit about employer sponsorship with the regional migration visas, okay, but that is quite separate from what I'm about to talk about. So the employer sponsorship leads to a permanent visa, and the subclass is 186, okay. So there are two streams under the subclass 186 visa. One of them is the direct entry stream. And this is for people who have never worked in Australia or briefly worked in Australia, which means that you can apply for this visa whether you're in Australia or outside Australia. But one thing you need to keep in mind is that this is tied to an employer sponsoring you. So if, for instance, you wanted to try your hand at getting a job from outside Australia and you were hoping that it would lead to permanent residency, you would need to first of all make sure that the occupation that you want to be employed in is again on one of the relevant lists. And then again, when you're looking for an employer, you also need to make sure that the employer is able to sponsor you to come into Australia. Now, I will be honest with you. Yes, I know that I have mentioned it as one of the popular pathways to migrate to Australia because I have seen and I know a few people who have come in through this pathway. But in terms of how popular it is in relation to the other pathways that I have mentioned, this would probably be the least popular option. It is, I don't want to say it is, yeah, it is difficult, okay, but not impossible to find this option, especially if you're outside Australia. But yeah, like I said, I do know people who have applied for jobs from outside Australia and they have been lucky enough to find employers who sponsored them to come work in Australia. So let's talk about the labor agreement stream, okay? The labor agreement stream just speaks to a system where a sponsoring employer goes into a labor agreement with the government, so they are party to that agreement. And what that agreement stipulates is, you know, the specific requirements of the job or the skill shortage that the employer is hoping to fill by recruiting people from overseas. Of course, they need to prove to the government that they have tried unsuccessfully to fill that shortage locally before looking outside. And with that, they would have to mention down to the tiniest detail all the requirements of that job. So the way that I think to describe or to differentiate the labor agreement stream from the direct entry stream is that the labor agreement applies to highly skilled, highly specialized skill shortages. Okay, so it needs people who possess a certain skill at a certain level and would obviously have highly specialized requirements as well that they are not able to fill locally. And then in that instance, the labor agreements permits such employers to then recruit people from outside of the country. And like I said, the visa that is granted under this stream is a permanent residency visa. Okay, So I hope that was clear enough for you, and I hope you've been taking notes. I will be coming very soon with other videos that explain in greater detail some of the options that I have mentioned in this video. Okay, so keep an eye out for that, and in the meantime, I hope you continue to stay safe. I'll see you again very soon.